is always a seller's market. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about what not to do when screening your tenant, which can save you tens of thousands of dollars. Now, I literally came up with this list of screening tenants for our rentals because of this experience that I went through with our very first tenant. And I've literally taken this list and I've given it to homeowners that we have worked with, where we have bought one of their investment properties because they were going through an eviction, or the house just needed a ton of repairs, or they were tired of landlording. When we bought their house from them, they had other investment properties. And so I've literally taken this list and I've given it to friends, I've given it to family, I've given it to homeowners where we have bought a house from them, because it is so important to screen your tenants. And I'm going to tell you firsthand why that is. So our very first house that we bought was here in Central Florida, and at the time I was a young mom. I had I don't know how old my son was at the time, but I think he was like a year and a half old. We were living in Georgia at the time, and we bought this house down here in Florida, and I was so excited because this was our first investment property and I was going to put a tenant in it. And first we had to do a little bit of work to it, so we did have to put some money into it, and I was so excited to just get a tenant in there and cash flow it and, you know, make all kinds of money from it. And so I was living in Georgia at the time, and I was traveling back and forth from Georgia to Florida. So we closed on the house, we put a whole bunch of money into it to replace some of the systems, to update some of the inside, and it was ready for a tenant. And so I came down from Georgia, and here's number one. The very first mistake that I made was I was impatient. Okay, I was impatient because I was down here in Florida with my 1.5-year-old son. I wanted to get back up to Georgia with my family. So I was literally just down here to try to find a tenant for our house. So at first we didn't have a lot of showings because I had the house priced a little bit too high. This was in a working class neighborhood. And so I slowly brought the price down, and all of a sudden I started getting some bites. And so the very first person who came to see it, who loved the house, told me that she wanted to move in. And I'm like, great, I can quickly screen this tenant, I can move her in, and I can go back up to Georgia. So the very first red flag, was when I did the background check and everything was great, and I did the credit check and her credit was very low. So I told her, no worries, I understand that the credit can be low, because guys, listen, sometimes, people are renting a property from you because their credit is too low, because their credit is too low to go buy a home, so they need to rent for a little while. So we don't disqualify anyone just because of their credit. But what we will do is either we'll require that they move in with the first month and last month's rent in addition to the security deposit, or we'll just increase the security deposit. So in this case, I told her, no worries, what we can do is just increase the security deposit. And she was so excited to move in. She was so happy that we were moving forward with her. So we went to go sign the lease, and the very first red flag was she showed up and she didn't have enough money for the security deposit. And so I said, okay, well, I will accept the security deposit in installments. And she was so happy, so we signed the paperwork. I gladly handed her the keys, and I went back up to Georgia, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I found a tenant so quickly. I'm gonna sit back and I'm gonna relax and I'm gonna enjoy all the cash flow coming in on this property, right? So month one goes by. She has the full amount of rent, but she doesn't have any more of the security deposit. So I said, okay. So month two comes by. Now she only has part of the rent, and she still doesn't have the rest of the security deposit. Month three goes by. Now she has a little bit less of the rent and still no security deposit. And you can probably see where the story is going. So I don't know how many months went by of this where I was still trying to collect the security deposit from her. I was only collecting partial rent from her every month, which is a big no-no. And then all of a sudden, what happened was no rent came through, right? All of a sudden it went from a little bit of rent to absolutely no rent. And then all of a sudden I couldn't get a hold of her. She wasn't answering her phone. So we had to start the eviction process. Now, I had never done an eviction before because this is my very first property. This is my very first tenant. So I'm going to give you some resources at the end of this phone call, because these resources have helped me tremendously. But I had to figure out how to do the eviction. And again, I was living out of state. So this was not easy. So we went ahead and filed the eviction. We gave her the 3-day notice. And about halfway through this eviction, I came back down to Florida for an investing course on, how to become a better investor and a better landlord. And so I remember this day so well. I was leaving the event. It was at the end of the day. I was tired. My, baby was at home with my mother-in-law all day, and I just wanted to get back to him. And I decided I was going to drive by the house because it had been a minute since we filed this eviction. She knew we were filing it because she received the 3-day notice, but I still hadn't gotten a phone call from her, and she wasn't picking up the phone. So after this event, I drove over to Orlando and fully expecting to, see cars parked in the driveway and them still living in it. And oh my gosh, what I pulled up to was a complete disaster. Okay, you guys, every single window in this house was busted in. The door was wide open, so I went and peeked my head inside. I wasn't gonna go inside because I didn't know at the time if someone was living there or not. So I kind of peeked my head in. There was junk everywhere, cockroaches everywhere. It looked like someone had literally taken a bat to the outside and the inside of the house. So I immediately had to call the police because I had to find a way to secure this house until the eviction was complete. So the police officer came over and he's like, hello, ma'am, fill out some paperwork. And he's like, oh, you know what? I've been to this house several times in the past couple of weeks. And I'm like, say what? He's like, yeah, we kept getting complaints from the neighbors because some family came down and I guess there was all sorts of shenanigans, I think is the word he used, going on at the house. And yeah, we kept getting calls about this house. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Right? So I filled out the paperwork, and I think 2 or 3 weeks later, the eviction finalized and we got the house back. And by this time, the house had tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. And what we found out was from the neighbors was that the tenant's daughter literally came to the house with her friend and took a bat, like a baseball bat, took a bat to the outside and the inside of this house because they were mad that, we were moving forward with this eviction. So from that day forward, I became a very, very disciplined landlord, and it's because of this experience, because that was my first landlording experience, that was my first tenant experience. She literally lived in the house for a few months, then I had to spend all this money on the eviction, and then I had to spend tens of thousands of dollars on this house to fix it up and get it back up on the market to get another tenant in there. So I'm literally pulling this list out of my back pocket for you because it is a very comprehensive list. I cannot remember it, which is why I use checklists all the time. But here's my list for screening a tenant. Number 1, we take a paper application. Anyone who is interested in that property, we don't move forward with any kind of background check or credit check, nothing until they fill out the paper application because we want to see on paper if they're qualified to move in. Now, our qualifications might be very different from you out there, but one of our major requirements for moving into the house is that they have to have a combined income of at least 3 times the rent. Okay, I don't care if it's 2 of them together or just one person, but they have to have at least 3 times the rent because I want to make sure that they can afford the rent and also be able to pay their bills and live. So that's number 1, is get everything down in a paper application. If they are ready to move on, if they qualify on paper, then I go to tenantalert.com, and this is a background and credit screening report. Now there's tons of services out there that you can use. I just happen to use this one, and it's really easy to use. You put their email information in, it gets sent to the prospective tenant. The tenant pays for pays on their end for it, so we don't have to do any of that. They fill out all of their information, and within 24 hours, we get a full report on background check, criminal check, both national and local. We get eviction records. We get all kinds of credit check. We get all kinds of information from that report. So tenantalert.com. Once they qualify on tenantalert.com, we then go on to an employment check. So I get the number to their employer. I call the employer to verify that they do in fact work there, just like a bank would if they were getting a loan on a house. Okay, a bank would do the same thing. So I'm just calling to verify that they do work there. Okay, in addition to the employment check, I also get the last 2 W-2 pay stubs from them. So the most recent W-2 pay stubs. And if they're a business owner, then I'll get the last tax return that they did, because I want to make sure, I want to verify that the income matches what they put on the paper application, and I want to also verify that they make 3 times the monthly rent in order to move in. Okay, so that is number 4 I think we're on. Next, I do a previous landlord check. So this one's interesting. I always call the previous landlord to see how they were as tenants, if they left the house in good condition, did the landlord have any problems or issues with them, did they have to use part of the security deposit for anything. Now, any tenant, any prospective tenant could put down anyone on that application. They could put down their best friend as their, previous landlord. And of course, I'm going to call whoever they, put down on that that application, and the person on the other end will say, yes, they were a great tenant, right? So I always verify when they fill out all their information on tenantalert.com, and we get that report from Tenant Alert. One of the things that it will list is all the previous addresses. So I look to see if what they're giving me, their previous landlord, is matching up with the Tenant Alert report where it lists all of the previous addresses. And then I go on public record to see who has, the address that they're giving me and the name that they're giving me, do they match up on public record? So if they're giving me Ashley, Smith at 123 Main Street in Orlando, Florida, I'm going to go onto public record and make sure that Ashley owns that house. So they are the owner of that home, and I'm going to call them and I'm going to ask my questions. Okay, so that's previous landlord check. Then I do personal reference check. Now, some of you might think, well, why would you do a personal reference check? Of course, they're going to list people who, are good personal references. Well, I can get a lot of information when I call a personal reference. For example, we have a house in Orlando. Great tenants, they're long-term tenants, we love them. When they were moving in, I had them list 2 or 3 personal references, and I called those references. And what I found out was they had been friends with these references for over 25 years. Right, so that told me they obviously have good relationships with people. They maintain relationships with people, which just kind of made me feel warm and cozy inside about renting my property to them, okay? So that's why I do personal reference checks. It's just I can get a lot of information from it. Okay, then if they've gone through all of these steps, I've checked marked everything on my list. It's now time to collect first month and security, or first month, last month and security upon signing of the lease. So I will meet with them personally with the lease. I tell them to bring a cashier's check, not a regular check, but a cashier's check. And it will be in the amount for the first month. Usually I typically take the first month's rent and the security deposit. If their credit is lower, sometimes it's first month, last month, and security deposit, or first month and a little bit higher on the security deposit. But they have to have the cashier's check in order to sign that lease. Another thing we do is collect non-refundable pet deposits. Now, we do have restrictions with our pets on our properties. We limit it to the amount of pets that they can have. We limit it to breed and weight. That's just our requirements. Yours can be totally different, but we do collect that when they sign the lease as a non-refundable pet deposit, so they don't get that back. We then finally do a move-in, move-out checklist with them. So we literally go around the house with them, and they point out anything that they see, anything that we see that was there prior to them moving in, so that when they move out, they don't get charged for the things that were there when they moved in. Also, it's a good way for them to point out things that might need to be fixed prior to them moving in. And then lastly, we collect rent on a platform called erentpayment.com. Now, I think paper checks from tenants is so old-fashioned. We do everything electronically now, including collecting our rent. So we no longer have to deposit checks into our bank account. We're no longer chasing tenants down for the rent, or them trying to find us to give us the rent checks. It's so easy to set up on their end. They set it up, it connects their bank account to our bank account. They can set it up as a reoccurring payment, so every month it pays it on the first. It's kind of a set it and forget it for the tenant. And when that rent gets processed, it goes into our account days later. Now, what's really cool about erentpayment.com is you can have those payments get reported to the credit bureau. So it can help the tenant increase their credit score if, say, they're, a couple years down the line want to go buy a home, or they want to go get another rental. So that's going to increase their credit score by making those payments on time every month. And what it does is it incentivizes them to make them on time every month, because as landlords, we can also report if they have a late payment. So we can report that to the credit bureau through erentpayment.com. Now, again, that's the third party that we use to collect rent electronically. There's so many other services out there, so do your research, do what you think fits best for you. Lastly, I just want to give you a great resource that I use here in Florida, and it's called FloridaLandlordNetwork.com. Now, this is how I found out how to do the eviction. This is how I found about landlord rights and tenant rights. They have so much free information and very discounted services on things like evictions and stuff like that. So if you live here in Florida, or maybe even if you don't live in Florida, some of this stuff can still apply. But if you live here in Florida, it's a great resource, FloridaLandlordNetwork.com. I use it all the time. So that is my comprehensive tenant screening list that I use for every single tenant now that moves into our property. And it is because of that first property, of that first experience that I went through. And I would never wish that experience upon anyone, though it does happen because we buy houses from landlords all the time. And it's not a matter of, it's just a matter of not knowing the steps to take. And it took me some really hard experiences to come up with this list. So I'm so happy that I was able to share it with you. I hope that this was helpful. If you or anyone you know has a house or an investment property who's tired of landlording, the house needs too many repairs, the tenants aren't paying, please give us a call. Go to carriebuysHouses.com. All of our contact information is there. I'd be happy to speak to you personally. That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got something out of it, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.